Hi, everyone. Hopefully now you're seeing the full screen of my presentation. So thank you again for having me here. And what I've tried to bring here today is to bring by the ends of my presentation or of this talk a reflection of what is critical environmental psychology, and maybe even some provocations for thinking about the development of critical environmental psychology in the future, based, as Sasha said, on my own research for the past years. And my research has been often on the green energy transition and socio-environmental injustices related with it from a psychosocial perspective. And so what I'm going to do is to precisely use some examples of my research on the green energy transition to reflect about what is critical environmental psychology with you. So as you all here surely know, we have every day we're more and more confronted with the fact that climate crisis is happening now already for a long time, and that it's having more and more acute and extreme consequences. So these are just some examples, but obviously there are many more that we all feel in the areas where we live and that we hear in the news that are happening all around the world. And as you are also surely familiar with, in the last years, one of the main sets of policies and measures that have been proposed by governments also everywhere around the world almost are an energy transition and associated measures. And also a lot of the measures that are being proposed and agendas that are being set up for mitigating climate change have to do with what is often called the renewable energy transition or the green transition, and associated initiatives and infrastructures that can go from the micro level in people's houses, such as with the use of smart meters and solar PV in their rooftops, to the macro level of large-scale energy infrastructures and renewable energy generation and associated infrastructures and networks of those, that are deployed within centralized systems, which are often the type of systems that we have in the countries where we live in for energy generation, production, and distribution. And what has also been quite clear in the last year, so accompanying the increasing of the deployment of these renewable energy infrastructures, is also that resistance to those infrastructures has also started to increase. And a lot of research from other areas of the social sciences, maybe not as much, also now it's starting to get there, but not so as much psychology, but researchers from other social sciences have started to give voice increasingly to these local resistances to renewable energy infrastructures and to the green transition in general. And they have started to give voice precisely to social and local movements that have been contesting the socio-environmental injustices that are created by these infrastructures and related activities. So here are just some examples, for instance, from Brazil, this movement that claims water and energy as commons, as not merchandising and commodities, and that therefore has been contesting large projects for hydropower plants. Here on the right as well, the same is happening in India, in this case in relation to huge areas that are starting to be covered by solar plants, and that's obviously the area that is used for solar plants is being taken away for traditional uses that are important for communities' livelihoods. And here as well, for instance, this is a very interesting example because these were huge protests that really mobilized a lot of people in Serbia regarding Rio Tinto's lithium mine in the Jadar Valley. And actually, I was telling Sasha before you all joined in that even in Portugal today, the Prime Minister has just offered his resignation precisely because he was accused of corruption in related with lithium mining as well. So Portugal is also, as you can see in this last picture, which is taken from a place in the north west of Portugal where lithium mining is trying to be done by the government, and this is a flag from a protest movement. And as I was saying, that's it. The Prime Minister has just been accused of being involved in corruption related with this lithium mining, and he has just offered his resignation because of it. And so the point here is precisely that these local contestations or social movements against the green energy transition, they are not necessarily against the green transition as such, as in the transition towards renewable energy sources and towards a more sustainable world, but they seem to be definitely against the way that is being done. And the way that is being done is often is obviously related with the fact that it is being done just by substituting the energy sources, but not by changing the socioeconomic and political processes behind that, and that accompany that. So basically, they're just continuing the business as usual of our fossil societies and just perpetuating capitalism as we know it. So we can even think of the green energy transition being maybe this pharmacon of the polycrisis, because actually when we think of it, energy nowadays, it's so ubiquitous for, economy, politics, everyday living, for everything really, that if we think of it from this relational perspective, we can really see how it is part and a core part really of all the many crises that we are facing nowadays. And this idea of the pharmacon, I think, encapsulates very well what the green energy transition is, but also obviously what many other processes under capitalism are. So capitalism lives precisely from this contradiction of the pharmacon almost always, which is that it causes the problems and offers solutions to them at the same time, and it lives by this creative destruction, as some would put it. So precisely that's the same here with the green energy transition. So what we've been witnessing is that there is no credible pathway to 1.5 degrees of global warming. We do know that the world would need to cut around 45% of carbon emissions by 2030. So if you look at this graph, for instance, we would need to go back at the level of emissions that we used to have around the late 70s, and so it's clearly not well, not that it's not feasible, but we can't anticipate how that could be done in such a short period of time, right? At least not with the solutions and the measures that we are taking right now. And what we see then is that there is this rhetoric of governments everywhere, of the EU, about the Green Deal and other fast-paced policies and technological changes, saying that the solution to all of this is just to accelerate these changes and specifically the green energy transition. But that's it. At the same time, or on the other side of the coin, what we also have been getting to know more and more, and it has become more and more evident, is that these political and technological changes, they are being done and proposed exactly in the same way as they were being done before for the fossil fuel societies that we have and for industrialization. So they continue with centralized and top-down systems and decision-making processes. The green energy transition itself, it involves large-scale infrastructures, as I've already highlighted, and is very resource-intensive as well. So it also needs minerals and materials like cobalt, steel, and lithium, that are also polluting and damaging for the communities and well, societies globally, really, but mainly for the communities near where they are extracted. Also, we've already seen, even with these examples that I've given, that the green energy transition, for sure, it's using a lot of land. So one of the pictures that I've showed before, it highlighted how in the US, to meet the demand of energy that will be needed in 2050, and if we are just depending on renewable energy sources, we would need a land area almost the size of Texas filled with wind farms to meet that energy demand for 2050. So there's clearly this increasing occupation of rural space, and rural areas, as we know as well, due to urbanization processes, also de-agriculturization or de-agrarianization of rural areas, they have been continuously disenfranchised and disempowered throughout the last decades. And so this is still another way of further disenfranchising and marginalizing rural areas. And so what we can see is precisely that the poison that the green energy transition also is that it is reproducing and even creating anew some social inequalities and structural power relations, specifically between rural and urban territories, also between the global north and the global south. And therefore, in this context, I think that environmental psychology specifically, but psychology in general, really has an important role to play in the green energy transition and in understanding several dimensions and aspects of these contradictions and ways to solve them. So obviously, one key important role that psychology and also specifically environmental psychology has already played for this problem, so to say, is that it's actually, as we also in critical environmental psychology know, environmental psychology and psychology generally, it has been a cause as well of the neoliberal capitalist systems and ways of thinking that we live in. So we know that psychology has contributed a lot to for us as both researchers, academics, but also as citizens, to think of individual change as social change. So psychology as a discipline has really contributed to produce this neoliberal subjectivity that we as individuals are responsible for everything and are the focus of everything. And this is well reflected and reproduced by environmental psychology and the mainstream research in it that has also focused mostly on trying to understand how individuals can and should change their individual pro or anti-environmental behaviors towards more sustainable societies. And it's also very present in this other area of research closer to the green energy transition, in the sense that also research on people's responses and relations with renewable energy infrastructures, for instance, it has often been framed through the NIMBY, not in my backyard explanation, which again is a way of dismissing and disconsidering people's concerns and the impacts that they suffer from the socio-environmental justices involved in deploying large-scale renewable energy generation infrastructures and other risky infrastructures in general. And so again, this is a discourse and a way of explaining people's responses and relations with these infrastructures that has been very promoted even and reproduced by psychology as a discipline, and with bad consequences, negative consequences for the state of things as they are with the green energy transition and the climate crisis in general. Also, at the same time, what we've seen as well, and specifically again in research in relation to the green energy transition, is that psychology, also other social sciences to some extent, have so far supported the green energy transition in a non-critical normative way. No? So as if the green energy transition was inherently good, independently of the way it is done, independently of who is promoting it, who owns it, and so on and so forth. So there has been not much questioning of how are sustainability and renewability practiced. So for sure, psychology and environmental psychology specifically, they have to do with this polycrisis, and specifically regarding the green energy transition and how it's being done as a cause, but also obviously, and more important to us here, I think it can have a really relevant role as an intervention tool as well to contribute to identify, understand, and also contest the climate crisis and associated socio-environmental injustices, specifically also in the green energy transition field. So these are obviously just some of the questions that we as critical environmental psychologists can and should ask and try to better understand and promote. And what I'm going to do now is precisely to try and show a bit of how can we do that also in empirical terms and through which theoretical framework. So I think that's a very important first step is precisely this move away from, I think this encapsulates it quite well, from the idea of the Anthropocene as the problem to be solved, so to say, to the Capitalocene as Donna Haraway and others before her have proposed. So I think it's very important precisely to move the focus away from humans as necessarily the source of the problem, and instead to move the focus to the socio-political and socio-economic systems that we have created throughout history and that left us here or took us here, and how to contest those systems and change those systems. As I said, other authors besides Haraway, such as Andreas Malm and Kara Daigetz, have very well illustrated the importance of this, so of focusing on this idea of the Capitalocene, precisely because they have shown that all the energy transitions that happen in the past, they did not have to do with humanity as such, but they did have to do with power relations and with specifically a given elite and who ever was dominating in a certain moment, wanting to maintain that power. And so they very interestingly show in their works precisely how every time there was an energy transition, so with farming, for instance, and then with steam engines in the industrial era, the aim was never to create a better quality of life for everyone or to use the most efficient and sustainable technology. It was always to use the technology and use it in a way that would reproduce power relations and that would benefit the already established elites. And so I think this same type of approach and mindset has to be used for us to think about, okay, so what is happening now with renewable energy and the green energy transition? And as I said, other social sciences and humanities have already started to do that and to really question precisely the intimate relations between the green energy transition as it is being done and neoliberal capitalism and its underlying political and cultural domination over certain groups of humans and non-humans. But that's it. So psychology and environmental psychology specifically, even if, as I said, they do have, I think, a lot to offer to that, they haven't yet started to do that in a more consistent way. So what does a critical psychosocial approach, or well, critical environmental approach if you want it, but we'll get to that, to the green transition look like? And I think here what I've done, at least in my research, is really to combine key dimensions of a critical social psychology approach. So obviously focusing on the individualization and the social construction of meanings, and focusing on trying to reveal and contest relations of domination, injustices, and discrimination, including those perpetrated by psychology itself as a discipline, so by us. And with the normative aim of promoting transformative social and political change towards equality and democracy. And I've tried to do that with a specific point of departure, specific epistemology and theoretical framework, which is that from the theory of social representations, which is from its incept a theory that is precisely relational, that focuses on this relation between ego alter object, that allows us as well to very well integrate into, as an inherent part of research, the relations between social issues, the relations between the micro and the macro, the local and the global, and so I think already for that it's a very useful and appropriate theory, but also, of course, because it has this potential for being an articulatory epistemology, in the sense that it has been used and several dimensions of it already by different disciplines and trying to combine different disciplines. And so I think it's a theory that lends itself very well to interdisciplinarity, which, as I will argue as well, I think it's key for a critical environmental psychology. And so what I'm going to quickly try then to do now is to show just some examples of then how can this type of framework be used for a critical environmental psychology that can explore, identify, understand, and intervene in the antecedents of unjust green transitions, the impacts of unjust green transitions, and also in contestations to unjust green transitions, and obviously then this being able to be translated into other areas of the climate crisis. So to show one example of my research with other colleagues on the antecedents of unjust green transitions, we just are concluding really a project that aimed to explore the potential relations between the way the green energy transition is being done socio-territorially. So this way that I've been talking about, often imposed in a top-down way with lots of local socio-environmental impacts and related injustices. And so without really involving anyone, and even sometimes further disenfranchising specifically rural populations. So we aim to understand, is that related with the fact that in Portugal specifically, but also, as we know, in other countries around the world and in Europe, there has been a rise in voters for right-wing populist parties, so far right-wing populist parties. And what we've seen in Portugal in some of the last elections is that it was precisely in rural areas where some of these renewable energy, large-scale renewable energy infrastructures have been deployed or are being planned to, that there was an increase in votes for Chega, which is the far-right populist party in Portugal. And so we wanted to analyze if there would be any relation between these two issues. And obviously, there's already some research that has shown that conservatives and even right-wing populist parties, they often tend to be climate change skeptics, even if already other research, more recent research, has said as well that some right-wing populist parties, actually, sometimes they might defend renewable energy, especially after the invasion of Ukraine, precisely because it allows sovereignty. So it might allow national self-sufficiency and sovereignty, and in that sense, some right-wing parties might also populist parties might also defend renewable energy specifically, even if not for climate change reasons, so to say. But so we wanted to explore this, and for that we conducted a media analysis of the main Portuguese newspapers to see if there was this relation being communicated in the media. And what we've seen was that there were three main teams organizing media discourses about the green energy transition. So just to preclude maybe that question, but we didn't find any direct discourses of Chega, this right-wing populist party, on on renewable energy or on climate change specifically. But what we did find was that the media organized their discourses about the green energy transition around three main themes. And those themes, or at least some of them, use the same type of rhetoric that often Chega and other far-right populist parties tend to use. So, for instance, the most transversal theme was this first one that presented Portugal at the forefront of the green energy transition. So it was a team that really focused on the green energy transition and on renewables as something only positive, and as something that puts Portugal, in this case, ahead of other nations, that makes us, or should make us, Portuguese proud, and that really talks about the deployment of this large scale. So, for instance, even here in this extract, you can see that they even kind of boast about this being one of the largest solar power plants in the world that is going to be built in Alentejo, a region of Portugal. So one of the biggest green projects in the world. So as you can see, the examples, the extracts of the discourses on this theme were all very similar to this. It's still this kind of progressive eco-modernist mindset, that is very typical also of industrialization and all that. So nothing changes really. It's just precisely the type of technology that changes. But what we can see here is that those technologies and their infrastructural materialization, they're just used again in this very modernist mind view or perspective. And so obviously this echoes with what Chega in Portugal often does as well, which is precisely to use this type of nationalist frame to talk about other issues such as migration and social inequalities and all that. Another theme that was also pervasive in the media articles was then this contrasting theme, which focused actually on the dark side of renewables. And in these courses that we found under this theme, what we found was that the media articles would actually already highlight some of the injustices that the green energy transition brings with it. So, for instance, they would highlight that often the construction of a solar plant, say, is just a business as any other, and who wins in that business are always the same: energy companies, urban areas, the government, and who loses, it's the normal citizen, the common people, and the local communities affected by it. So what we have here, and what we found out, is that a problem with these themes is that they present these issues first separately. So they either present the renewable energy transition as positive, or they present it as only negative, and they do it in a way that resonates a lot with the rhetoric that Chega, the far-right populist Portuguese party, also tends to use. So, for instance, the second theme resonates a lot with this discourse typical of far-right wing populist parties of the common people against the corrupt system. And then we found a third, less pervasive theme, which was actually opening the debate and trying to think of and putting forward solutions for the injustices related with the green energy transition, and that highlighted specific ways such as decentralization, more community involvement, etc., for actually effectively implementing a just energy transition. So what we've seen then that I've already suggested is that the articles, the media discourses about the green energy transition revealed some ambivalence. Some articles accentuated only renewable energy as a sign of national progress, and they wouldn't discuss any impacts that they can have for local communities, for rural areas. So they would be dismissive of the people and just focus on this nationalistic perspective, so to say. Whereas others would then be very critical in relation to the way the energy transition is being materialized, and would criticize the installed elites and the system which is corrupt, which is also a type of rhetoric that Chega and other far-right populist discourses tend to use. So what we found out is that albeit implicitly and indirectly, Portuguese media discourses do seem to support some elements of Chega's rhetoric, and therefore it's very important that the articles in the media try to be more complex and less simplistic in how they present the green energy transition, and to be more multivocal about it. Precisely that it doesn't seem to be either black or white, and as I said, so that it doesn't resonate with far-right populist rhetoric. So that's an example of an antecedent of the green and just energy transition that can be studied by a critical environmental psychology approach. And that is very important because that's it. Ultimately, what we can then think is, are people going to resist and be skeptical to any green energy transition? No, and that's the danger of right-wing populist discourses being tied to the green energy transition. But in other research that I've conducted with other colleagues, we've also looked particularly at the psychosocial impacts of the unjust green energy transition. And in this case, by using particularly this framework of renewable energy colonialism. So we wanted to explore particularly if and how the deployment, in this case of large-scale hydropower plants, was colonizing rural areas in Portugal, and was reproducing structural inequalities between urban and rural areas that I've already mentioned in the beginning of my presentation. And in this research, we departed from a controversy that happened some years ago about the sale of these dams that are in the pictures to a French consortium. And when it was announced that they were going to be sold, there was a big controversy, and specifically from the local communities living nearby, that created a protest movement and really protested for the right to receive some of the money that was going to be made out of this sale. Because so far, obviously the expectation for the government and the energy company was that this would just be a transaction between them and involving them and the French consortium, and no other stakeholder or actor. And what we use this controversy for was precisely to ask, well, but let's see then how has hydropower been deployed in Portugal, not only now, because actually these dams were built during the dictatorship. So Portugal lived in a dictatorship from 1926 to 1974. These dams were built during the 50s, 60s. And they were now being sold to this French consortium, and now they were contested by this protest movement that wanted some benefits for the local region. And we wondered, well, has this happened only now? Has this happened since they were built? How has hydropower been deployed in the country, and which issues of justice or injustice have been involved in that? And so we use this framework of renewable energy colonialism, as I said, precisely because we think like it really encapsulates well all the structural processes and dynamics from which the way the deployment of these energy infrastructures is done, and it can also capture its impacts and the continuing of those structures. So how does that happen through each specific processes? And so what we've done then was what we've called the psychosocial historiography of key large-scale hydroelectric power plants in Portugal. So we focused on these ones that were sold recently to the French consortium, but also other key ones in the main regions of Portugal that had been deployed throughout history and that were large scale and we knew had a lot of impacts, namely the submersion of villages and their relocation to other places. And so to investigate this, we used archival analysis, interviews with participants in the movement, contesting those 3 dams that were sold to the French consortium, and also media analysis. And what we tried to look at then was, okay, so how does this renewable energy colonialism, how is it felt, and also how does it happen? And here I'm calling it hydrocolonialism because it's related specifically with hydropower plants. And so we've said that it happens at 3 levels. So one of them is that hydrocolonialism happens discursively. So what we found out is that it happens at often by the discourses of ministers, of governments, of local authorities, of energy companies that present these energy infrastructures as something positive, only positive, as something that will bring local socioeconomic development, even if they don't provide specific estimates, for instance, of how many jobs it will generate, which benefits it will bring. So a lot of this hydrocolonialism is really just performed discursively and rhetorically. No, it's proposing or promising even that a series of good consequences and benefits will happen to these communities that are already deprived and are already in socioeconomic hardship, so that they better accept and so that they better let these infrastructures being imposed on them. And another second dimension through which hydrocolonialism is enacted then is not only discursively, but also obviously as proper infrastructural harm, because eventually, even if not always, as I'll highlight as well, but often the plans, they do get transformed into proper infrastructures, material infrastructures that are built and that they bring very material and concrete bodily impacts with it. So, for instance, in this extract, this participant talks about a quarry that was needed to build one of these dams with 40 meters of height, and that was left open in the place where he lived, and used to be there playing as a child, and so it was like a risk and a danger that this infrastructural harm was left there like that. And then obviously, as could be expected, there are very specific also psychosocial harms that happen just because of the violence of both the plans and the infrastructures that are going to be built or that are proposed. So with a hydropower plant, we can imagine in cases where villages are submerged and people have to relocate, that's a very direct and violent psychosocial harm. But also something interesting in a perverse way that we found in this research was really that the psychosocial harms, they start even when the project is first announced, and sometimes, for instance, that was in the 1960s or in the 1970s, and then maybe the dam is only constructed 30, 40 or 50 years after it is first announced. And sometimes it's in planning throughout that whole time, and it's not built in the end. And so that was the most striking findings that we found, is precisely that there is this prospective injustice, that really, as we say, kidnaps almost people's future to be, because people are constantly trapped in this ghost almost of a plan that might happen or might not happen. And if it happens, it has very violent consequences and extreme consequences for their lives. But also, if it doesn't happen, it has those consequences all the same, because people have to keep making decisions in relation to this ghost, to this shadow of an infrastructure that is there, and that they don't know if it's going to be built or not, with what consequences. And that was very clear in all the cases that we've analyzed, that there's very little involvement of the communities. They are very little informed of what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, with which consequences for them. And this perspective injustice was effectively one of the main psychosocial arms that we identified, besides obviously the other more material and direct ones. And finally, just to give quickly another example of psychosocial contestations, I mean, I've already given one of this movement that contested the sale of these dams to the French consortium. But what was interesting while doing this research as well was that through the archival material and the interviews we've done with people living near those 3 dams that were sold to the French consortium, we were able to bring back the fact that when the dams were first built, and even if we were living during a dictatorship, which obviously didn't really allow protest as such, but there were already contestations to the dams. And even it's interesting, because people then they didn't know what the dam was, and so they would protest against the cuts in the river. They would contest these cuts in the river. And what we saw as well was that even regarding another dam, also in the north, in the border with Spain, there was also already more recently, in 1991, a huge protest that was not very well known in the public sphere, but that even involved a hunger strike. A hunger strike from the Spanish side, particularly the Spanish communities affected, that said, and this movement, this hunger strike, was led by this idea that these people and this church, so it was a church that was very important to them, and this was going to be submerged by this dam, do not surrender, together until we die. And so through this psychosocial historiography, as we've called it, we were also able to uncover many other contestations to these dams throughout time that are often not talked about. So often in the media, in the public sphere, the dams are just presented as, again, positive, and as if they are not contested, even if they are. So here, there was another example from my research also on contestations to unjust green transitions, and how we can study them from a critical environmental psychology perspective. But maybe I'm just going to go to the end now and wrap it up, so that we have some more time also to discuss. So what does a critical psychosocial, or again, environmental psychology approach to the green transition look like? So I've tried to show, even if in a brief way, how it can help us precisely to explore, identify, understand, and intervene in antecedents, impacts, and contestations to, in this case, the green energy transition. And what I think my research so far has brought me to reflect about what is critical environmental psychology specifically, is that it has showed me that we, in critical environmental psychology, we have to do that, so explore these antecedents, impacts, and contestations, while considering first, as a bottom line, the simultaneous, discursive, structural, historical, cultural, political, and economic dimensions of the climate and related crises and issues. Then another very important aspect as well, that I think that often environmental or critical environmental psychology specifically also tends to neglect, is that we also have to do that while reclaiming and putting center stage alongside the climate crisis and human-nature relations, the focus on space and the built environment from the origins of environmental psychology, which I think are also very important to develop this critical psychosocial environmental approach towards post-capitalist societies. Because as I've tried to illustrate as well, the struggles that we have nowadays and the inequalities that are produced and reproduced, they have a lot to do with space, and they have to do a lot with who owns that space, who has the right to that space in many different shapes, through infrastructures, through space as neighborhood space, as public space. So I think that's quite important not to forget and to further integrate in our critical environmental psychology research. Another key aspect, I think, as well, is also to rethink and expand the methods and empirical foci that we use. For instance, I've showed media analysis, but also policy analysis are a key part for critical environmental psychology. So what are policies doing? How are they representing citizens and their agency and all that? Also archival investigation of materialities. And finally, also this issue of revisiting the history of disciplinarity. So this idea that interdisciplinarity is the colonial or transdisciplinarity, if you prefer. And so what are the costs, so to say, and positives or contributions of a critical environmental psychology as such? Now, I think this is also something very important to reflect about going forward with a critical environmental psychology. And so for future research, and here it's also still a bit of some recent research that I've conducted with some students, as I said, focusing on the space and the built environment. For instance, this research has been focusing on analyzing graffiti and street art as counter-hegemonic discourses, and how do they occupy the public space now to contest, for instance, or in this case, to reclaim the right to housing, to contest climate change and the climate crisis. And again, this shows that we also need to integrate better the role of space and materialities in critical environmental psychology. So that's it. I think this question of what can critical environmental psychology do and maybe also do not do, I think it's a good question for us to think about going forward. And yeah, I would like to thank just the people that also worked with me on these issues, and to thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Susanna, for this insightful talk. And yeah, really glad to have you. I would open the floor for questions. Feel free to raise your hand with the emojis, or post a question into the chat. Yes, I have first question by Dimitros.
Hi. So first of all, thank you very, very much for this very, very interesting talk. It's something to expect since we follow your work for some years now. I'm super pleased to see, a socio-psychological presentation that speaks of the bad word. I mean, capitalism, of course. So yes, that's great. Just two questions or remarks or suggestions. The first is, so since you do that, right, and that's something that doesn't really happen in social psychology, I think that it's not enough today to just say, social psychology has a liberal or even a neoliberal bias. We have to start systematizing that, and even more, we have to start suggesting theoretical and operational ways of studying capitalism and its ideology. Because I think, if I may say, there is a sort of small disconnection between the part where you say, hey, let's talk about capitalocene, and what you do further on. It's kind of like you have this big narrative, and then it kind of disappears in a way. I mean, it's still there in an indirect way in your results, in your methods, and so on. But theoretically, it kind of disappears because you go back to social psychology. And I think that one of the reasons is that people don't speak of capitalism in our discipline. Now, of course, there is power dynamics and so on and so forth. Students, PhD students, it's not easy to publish on capitalism. I mean, where are they going to work after, which applied program and so on. But there is also the question like, which theoretical and conceptual model, what do we mean by it? And that's super complicated for social psychologists that ground their concepts on individual behavior and so on. So I think that we should really start, shifting our grammar discursively and start speaking of it and theorizing it from what can we do as social psychologists? Ideology, representations, no matter what, but we have to bridge the concepts. I think this is our task now, from now on. Like, that's an idea. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dimitris. No, I fully agree, but I think that I mean, I didn't have the time to fully also frame the different research that I presented, through how I framed it, for instance, in the papers published with that and all that, but I do think that as well, yes, one first key entry point for psychologists, I think it's a lot precisely on and if psychology can have say distinctive contribution to other disciplines, I think it's precisely, for instance, of this contribution of the impacts of capitalism. So what does capitalism do specifically in terms of psychosocial impacts? And I think the research with Sophia Coopers, for instance, on the hydrocolonialism shows that very well, or in the same way as well, the antecedents of capitalism as well, and how that is related with how media communicates and how it links, for instance, or not, in certain ways, the renewable energy transition with far-right populist discourses. So I think, again, yes, it's very important that we start addressing more what is capitalism and how can we tackle it, so to say, from a social psychology perspective. But then I think that's also then maybe we need to ask this question of should we just have this transdisciplinary approach in which through which we maybe can tackle that whole question, or are we just focusing more on what is psychological, so to say, about capitalism?
Yeah, thank you much. Just to add my 5 cents, I don't know if you're aware of the special issue that appeared in SPSSI on the social psychology of neoliberalism, and it might be a good start to pick this up. And yeah, we have another question by Mirella. Or Dimitras, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I think that it's super interesting that we work on neoliberalism, and it's definitely this main ideology of state and citizenship for the past, I don't know, 40 years or whatever. But, some Marxists would suggest that there are even some people that call it an avoidance strategy. Yes, neoliberalism is a main problem, but within the global framework of capitalism, neoliberalism reproduces what is bad in the capitalist system itself. So we should involve stuff that are not just neoliberalism and subjectivity, because subjectivity is one way to look at it. I'm not sure it's the most productive way when it comes to capitalism, but it's a very interesting social way. Yeah, sorry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mirella.
Yes. Hello to everyone. Nice to meet you. It is a pleasure to associate a face to these names that I've been reading for years now. And I just had a curiosity for Ms. Battel, which is, even though you are a critical psychologist, social psychologist, have you ever had the chance to support a project, infrastructure project, in a way that the project could be more just? And if so, how did it go? Did it work? And what kind of methods did you use to facilitate this just infrastructure?
Yeah, that's a very good question. That has happened at a smaller scale with this energy community that is being set up in Portugal, but not as such with a large scale project. No, because I think at least here in Portugal, that's it. You have this difficulty of engaging the large energy companies or corporations for this type of process. And what we're trying to do now, though, is to try and work with them and for actually not a just project, but actually towards a just transition in a specific region in Portugal to the south of Lisbon that is moving away from its fossil fuel industry to renewables. But again, it's very difficult because that's it. It's a very complex process in which you have to involve many different actors, and it involves like the loss of jobs from the previous industry and then how to integrate them in the new industries. And as I said in the beginning, just today with the resignation of the Prime Minister and this controversy that happened in Portugal due to precisely corruption in the green hydrogen and lithium mining industries, you can see that it's very difficult precisely because of this, because there's lots of precisely interests, economic interests behind, and that goes back to capitalism discussion that we were having, and therefore, yeah, I don't have an easy answer to that. Obviously, the smaller the scale, the easier it is to make it more just, because it's easier to involve everyone and to hear everyone's voice and consider a lot of different dimensions. And the more centralized and with more corporates and incumbent stakeholders, the more it involves those, the harder it gets.
Thank you. And I can imagine that some gaps are easier to be filled. Like if you have very collaborative stakeholders, then you can facilitate the dialogue between all these different groups. But something that for me it's difficult to imagine in how could we as social psychologists help during something like the infrastructurization of a project is a problem, a matter of space, which is the familiarity, the lack of familiarity actually that people have visually with the infrastructure. So even if they accept many facets of a project and they agree with how it's being done, but they just don't like how the infrastructure occupies the space visually, then I think it can be very hard to facilitate a different response from the public, because it could be just a matter of familiarity and needing time to adjust. I don't know if that's right, though, because I'm just starting to study this argument.
Yes. Well, I think, yeah, for sure, there are several examples of also large scale. Then also there are very large scales. No, they can be very different, but for sure, for large scale projects for renewable energy infrastructures that have been well accepted in the communities, if precisely there were more discussions and co-governance of the project itself, and if the people were better involved since the beginning, and all these different dimensions of well, justice and participatory decision-making processes were more taken into account. But even then, I think also that's it. It's this issue and this paradox of capitalism again that we were discussing earlier. Now that it creates and allows, which is that even in that type of case, you always wonder if people are actually supporting it. No, because often it's because they need the revenues, they need also that type of infrastructures to be able, for instance, to stay living in that region, for their children, if they have them, to stay, you know, next generations to stay in that region as well, to be able to accommodate also certain livelihoods. So yeah, so to what extent that is really then you know, accepting it or not, I think it's very debatable. And precisely what that study about right-wing populism and all that, we did a second study focusing on rural communities that are affected by these infrastructures. And for instance, what we've seen there is that there's already almost this kind of discourse that is almost accepted as natural, as an hegemonic representation, say, that is just a given, almost unconscious. People didn't reflect much about it, which is this idea that if you live in a rural area and you have, you know, more access to natural resources and to a certain quality of life that is more tranquil, you know, with more tranquility and calmer and more pure air, that already has to come with certain costs. No, you can't have both. And then you have to not have good transports, you have to not have good health services in rural areas, you have to not have jobs. So there's almost already this, acceptance that rural areas, okay, they can give you pure air and natural well-being, so to say, but then it has to come at a cost now. And I think this is precisely a creation of capitalism, so to say, no, that it seems that that's the only possibility that exists. No, for having one, you can't have the other. No, for a dignified life, so to say.
Jack, maybe I will expand on this question. Have you taken up any community psychological methods? And if so, is this easily doable, workload wise? And like talking to someone else recently in the UK, I learned that for them it's sometimes even problematic if their political standpoint is identifiable in a way, so that if they align with, for example, or have been seen on social media demonstrating for certain causes, there could be like a claim on like the ethical board that they're not allowed to conduct this research. So there have been instances, especially in the UK, where there's a strong backlash, right, against wokeism and critical race theory. How do you perceive this in your work? And have you had any problems with that so far?
Yeah. No, I mean, I can certainly feel that increasing. I haven't experienced that yet personally here in Portugal, but I can see how even with the events today, now how that will happen more and more. And I think even these closing doors of these big institutions and these big players and even public administrations, if you tell them what your work is about, so if you're very clear about it, they often also won't participate in it. So for instance, now even in the context of this project, we wanted to share the results and discuss it with local stakeholders, and that's it. Like the moment you question, for instance, okay, shouldn't it be more collaborative and benefits of this project distributed? So something even as simple as that towards the local communities. You already have like people not wanting to engage with the discussion and just not wanting to be facing this type of questioning. So yes, it hasn't happened yet, but I can feel other ways of that happening, even if more indirectly, and I can see it happening more in the future for sure.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I see another question by Michael.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. I found it really interesting, and I've found especially interesting your focus on studying interrelations with capitalism. Then I have kind of a methodological question that kind of accompanies me like just for quite some time already, and that is, I always wonder like how do you deal with identifying what kind of parts of our societies are like we can identify as the capitalist aspect of it, because like there is almost no society nowadays on this planet where the macrostructure isn't capitalist in some sense.
Yeah.
And like how can we identify, say, okay, this is what capitalism does, and this is what, for example, the just being used to that industry works in a certain way has done with us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a very good and relevant question. I mean, I don't know. I think, yes, you can still even, I think that's why our work is important, is to try and pinpoint that and what is still happening, and that we try to disengage from us as well being under capitalism and try to identify it, to question it, and I think that that's it. I think as I was trying to say, psychology, I think it can contribute precisely to understand what capitalism is and how it's enacted in the everyday, and then that's why it's consistently and continuously reproduced, precisely by focusing on its experiencing on the everyday, and how does it happen in people's lived experiences, and I think that's for sure a singular contribution from a critical psychosocial approach. But also, I think, for instance, in this work about hydrocolonialism, it was very interesting because this historical approach that we adopted, and focusing on different dams as well, and also because we focused on the history of those dams throughout the country, and from the dictatorship to the democratic period in Portugal. And what we could see is that everything was more or less, I mean, the dictatorship and the democracy, they had huge differences, in terms of, freedom of speech, of being, of, a lot of those things. But for the dams and for hydrocolonialism, actually, the same processes happened, the same dynamics throughout the country. And so, for instance, we did explain that through this renewable energy colonialism, very linked to capitalism. So it's capitalism really, and the drives of capitalism that is similar throughout the two periods, the dictatorship and the democracy, and that's why there aren't really much changes. I mean, obviously, yes, also in the democracy, they started doing environmental impact assessments, but it's everything very superficial. There was no real transformation, and we explain it through capitalism, because it's the same drive towards economic growth, towards the power relations that constitute capitalism, and that hasn't really changed. So the democracy did bring many changes, but not to the questioning of really. So it's this, as Franquesa puts it, it's like a transaction between power elites, but not really a transformation. So yeah, in that case, for instance, just to wrap it up, I think adopting this historical perspective and this large geographical focus in which we focused on different themes as well, it allowed us to come to this conclusion that it was capitalism as a process that was common, no, to the background of all the cases.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
We have one final question from the chat that I will read out loud to you before we close this session. What do you think are alternatives to the big green projects? So probably also referring to hydrocolonialism. Are there some examples in Portugal?
So as I was saying, there's some attempts, at least at those examples, more decentralized energy generation and consumption as well, namely through this idea of renewable energy communities, and I think that's could be for sure a way forward. But the issue, I think, is precisely that even that, again, within the neoliberal capitalism that we live in, and this always the attempt of commodifying everything and using it to feed into capitalism. What we are also already seeing, even in that, is that renewable energy communities are also being used by big players and corporations to feed again into the normal centralized and energy system. So I mean that could surely be a way, but then again it's how to break with these other infrastructures and networks that is difficult, and also how to be self-sufficient from those in a way. And I think, again, that's it. I think another key issue of capitalism that we can also focus on through a critical psychosocial approach is also that. No, it's also the way it pervades through many different demands of nowadays lives, our lives. No, that and that also doesn't allow us and prevents us from having the time and space to think about alternatives, to try and do alternatives. No, for you to really, if you want to really set up a renewable energy community that is autonomous and is more self-sufficient and all that, you really have to have so many resources, personal, community, time, that are also cut short by the many demands of our societies, that are created also by capitalism in one way or another. So yes, but I would see that as a way forward. But again, we also have to pay attention to how it's being kidnapped again by the same actors.